Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Sandman, Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. So, I had gone on and known a little bit about this character beforehand, because of course, I went on to Kevin Smith's YouTube channel, and eventually at some point he and Mark Bernardin had went on and talked about this character and how it would be cool if one day they went on to do a show or a movie about the Sandman, and coincidentally it ended up happening. Funny enough, also in the later seasons of Smallville, when eventually they went on to do like Hawkman and All American Boy, within a Justice Society storyline or episode or whichever it was, where they tied in like Doctor Fate and stuff like that. Eventually, there was also within that show a character called the Sandman, which it's a similar character, but it's not this character. Um, but if anything, it's the Sandman. It's like a slight variation of it, but technically, since this Sandman is also a DC comic book character, like it's interesting to kind of see the history of this character being used in other mediums or other things. Speaking of which, there eventually will be a character who is to be Lucifer in this show, who actually is the exact same Lucifer as the Lucifer that was in the Lucifer show. Um, that eventually they end up making a joke in that Lucifer show that Lucifer should actually have blonde hair, and funny enough, this Lucifer is to actually be the more, I guess, technically comic book accurate Lucifer from the DC comic book world. So, but I think that's just kind of funny. Uh, we also have a Constantine in this show. Of course, I think we have like a female version of Constantine. So it's not actually John Constantine, like the blonde and whatever. It's slightly different. Hence why, of course, John Constantine had to be written out of Legends of Tomorrow, because, of course, another show was going on and doing Constantine, so they had to write it out. Because it's all about rights and weird, goofy things, even though there's a slightly different version of Constantine out here, and they have to pronounce it differently and all kinds of stuff, so on and so forth. But anyways, interesting enough, also we have like two different ravens in the show. One that is to be Jessamy, and eventually one that is, I guess, to be Matthew. Um, I guess Matthew is to be way more known as far as the Raven character. I guess I don't know why. But it was harder for me to find the actual name of the first crow within the show for whatever goofy reason. But anyways, um, other than that, like there were certain things where I was thinking, I'm like, well, there's like the one where they talk about the helm and that eventually it is to be with some demon character. I was like, well, wait a minute, is that Etrigan? Is that the demon Etrigan? Is that like but I was getting way too ahead of myself. I was like, oh my god, just imagine if they had like Jason Blood and they had the demon Etrigan thing. That would be so cool. But I'm like, I think I'm getting way too ahead of myself to think that they would roll in all of this stuff. But we'll see how this show goes. And eventually we'll have to go on and see Constantine, because we haven't seen her quite yet in the show. But it's also interesting because the Sandman was to mention that he had known a Constantine from before. And so it's like, well, what Constantine are we looking at here? And so on and so forth. But anyways, so with this show, definitely visually just amazing looking, cool looking for a lot of people that like Fantastic Beasts and Harry Potter stuff. Eventually will probably like this show also. Once we get into the dream realm of things, like those visuals were just so cool. To see like Pegasus and dragons and all kinds of cool stuff being in that dream world, and to see these kind of random visuals because it's just dream world and it has to be as random as could be. To see a guy with just a jack-o'-lantern face on was kind of cleaning up certain things was kind of cool. But anyways, with that said, within these first two episodes, we go on and we're kind of showing how the Sandman has kind of his own realm. So for those of you, we have to kind of immediately compare like the Sandman to like Thor. How like Thor has Asgard, we have the Sandman who has his own dream realm, which is kind of his version of Asgard, and the Sandman is to go on and call like the world that we live in is the real world, and that he, of course, is to go on and eventually make his way into the real world to try to capture some nightmare of his. And eventually he fails that and eventually is to be captured and contained by this kind of pentagram, um, or this kind of thing that has all these symbols upon it that is to keep him contained till eventually he has his own like bubbled like cell, and then eventually is to go on to escape and try to resurrect his dream world within these first two episodes and figure out how to get all of his wares and things that he was to have when he starts this show. Eventually he needs to go on and track them down, which will lead them to certain characters that we may or may not be fairly familiar with. But let's go on into double fiving this bad boy up, because I think it's about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time we spoil this show. Yeah, kind of heavily teed it up there, but yeah, really, definitely thumbs up show. I really enjoyed it, so let's get into it. So, in the very beginning of this, we have the Sandman or Dream, who is to break it down that he is to be like a godlike figure, and there is to be a number of other gods that he is to go on and at some point possibly deal with, like Lucifer or Desire or Destiny, and so on and so forth. And so Dream, of course, is to tell us that he has his own dream realm, and eventually is to be the one that everyone usually falls asleep and sees at some point, and eventually has dreams and nightmares that are to be intertwined in there. So we see a number of like interesting Easter egg like things, and it's all very well and cool. So we go on and we have the Sandman, who is to want to take off from the dream realm while talking to a woman named Lucienne, to eventually try to capture one of his nightmares who had snuck off to eventually make his way into the real world. And this guy is to be called the Corinthian. And this guy eventually, once you see what his eyes look like and how basically a lot of people will see how this guy's eyes look like that meme, of course, and so eventually, man, is that kind of funny. So we have the Sandman that makes his way and is to have this helm on, this kind of gas mask, and this ruby, and this sand, the sand on him. So we have the Sandman making his way to the real world, where he's trying to capture the Corinthian who had just killed somebody. And so the Sandman is to go on to tell the Corinthian that it's like, well, hey, like, you need to come back to me, or come back with me to the dream world. And the Corinthian's like, no, like, how about you and I just stay here, because like we can do whatever we want here, we can do whatever we want whenever we want to do it, and there's no one to stop us. and the Sandman is to tell the Corinthian, it's like, well, with that point, that is the one thing that you got wrong, because of course, the Sandman is to be there to try and stop the Corinthian, and by the time that the Sandman tries to attempt to do that, all of a sudden he disappears, because there's another story I have to tell here. So, we have Dr. John Hathaway that is to make it to this seemingly huge mansion to talk to a guy named Roderick Burgess, who a lot of people probably know him from either movies like The Golden Child or even Game of Thrones. Will be probably the thing that people probably know him from most. But so we have Roderick Burgess, who is to eventually talk to Dr. Hathaway to eventually obtain this book of spells, because of course we have Roderick who wants to obtain the Angel of Death to try and persuade this Angel of Death to give him back his son that he had lost in this war. This war of which of a name of a place that it's fairly hard to pronounce. It's like Palalali, Palalali. I'm butchering that because that's a very hard name to pronounce. So Roger goes on and is to talk to this man who has also lost a son, and so that's kind of the way of which that Roger can manipulate this guy. Alex is to go on and answer the door for Dr. John Hathaway, and is to say that Roderick likes to be called Magus, because I guess it means sorcerer. But that name never really comes up after this moment. They all call him Roderick. So Roderick is to go on and use this spell and have a number of people all chanting and this and that. To eventually have this kind of pentagram, or this eventual symbol that is to be placed upon this ground, to all of a sudden have this Sandman magically appear. So we go on to have Alex start to grab some of the items that the Sandman is to have: the ruby, the sand, the helm, which is the gas mask. So we go on and we possibly have Roderick who's thinking, it's like, well, maybe if we take all of this stuff, maybe the Sandman will want to bargain with us to get these items back. But he doesn't. So eventually Roderick is to go on and have the Corinthian appear to him, and is to let him know that at some point Roderick needs to go on and figure out a way to really contain the Sandman, because the pentagram that is to be around the Sandman won't hold him for long, that he needs to be in this kind of very glass-like cell that eventually is very circular and could contain him a lot better. And the Corinthian is to also tell Roderick to be aware that there is to be a raven that the Sandman is to be called, that is to be had with him, called Jessamy, and that Roderick eventually needs to figure out a way to kill this raven. So we have Roderick who's to build this cell, and so Roderick is to consistently ask the Sandman that Roderick knows that the Sandman is to be like one of the Endless, and is to be like the god of dreams, and that since the Sandman isn't actually the Angel of Death, of which that Roderick is to want, Roderick is still hoping that he can bargain with the Sandman to try to get his son from out of whatever afterlife he is to go on and have. Or that Roderick is to also try to ask the Sandman for wealth, immortality, any number of things. And the Sandman, of course, is not bargaining with Roderick, to where Roderick continues to beg the Sandman for any number of these things to eventually uh, have the payment of Sandman's freedom be, or have the reward of that gift to eventually be the Sandman's freedom. So we have Roderick, who eventually goes on and has a party at his place. And eventually, and this is after 10 years have passed, where we now have a much more older Alex. And so we also, during this time, while Sandman is to be contained within the cell, we have a number of people that are having problems either sleeping or awakening. Meaning that there are certain people, like there's certain kids who have fallen asleep and are to remain asleep to be in this coma like state, or we have some people that cannot go to sleep and they are losing their minds. Going on, I had seen this movie on Netflix called Awake from 2021. Very interesting. I probably should have gone on and reviewed it, but I think it was right around a time where I was still like not able to really come on here and do reviews. So I just so happened to see that movie, and that was kind of interesting to see a number of people who all could not sleep all at the same time, and they were starting to lose their minds, and it was kind of an interesting film. But anyways, we go on to have a much older Alex at Roderick's party, and Alex is trying to shoo a number of people away because there can only be so many people at this party. And so it seems nobody's really listening to Alex because it's like, well, hey, who are you? And we have this woman named Ethel Cripps who ends up coming in of like, well, hey, like, Alex is actually just as powerful as his father is, and like he basically has the power to let anybody come in or out of here, and like so like eventually you guys should actually come in here the next time around and bring money if you want to really come in here. So Alex all of a sudden is to see Ethel and is to be happy that she was there because she went on and she was to kind of give Alex the confidence he needed for that time to kind of shoo these people away. And so Alex is looking at Ethel and saying like, well, like, what do you want for like you helping me out at this point? And we have Ethel who is saying like, well, hey, if I can just meet your father, like that would be great. So Ethel goes on and meets with Roderick, and it seems that Roderick and Ethel end up making a relationship out of this, so much so that it seems like they are to be consistently be bedded together. And eventually this leads to them having a child, possibly. So Alex is to go on and eventually find out that certain guards are to not be showing up to watch over the Sandman because supposedly the Corinthian uh, was to tell these guys to like, hey, like go on and guard over the Sandman, but make sure that you never fall asleep in front of him, or he'll figure out a way to escape via doing that. And so make sure that you guys end up taking certain medications to stay awake when you're around him. So we had the Corinthian telling Roderick all of this, and so Roderick followed it all to the letter. So we have Alex that goes on and seeks out the Sandman, and when eventually there was no guards there, and so Alex was to go on and possibly talk to the Sandman and say, like, well, hey, like, if you don't hurt me, like, maybe I'll go on and I'll release you, and I'll help you. All of a sudden, we have Roderick, who is hearing this whole conversation, grabbing Alex and beating him, and eventually then seeing the Raven outside, Jessamy, and we of course have Roderick, who is to force Alex to try to go after this Raven to kill it off. So, as well as Alex is to go on and talk to Ethel and find out that she's pregnant, and that Roderick doesn't want the pregnancy and he wants to find a doctor to try to get rid of it. So we have Jessamy, the Raven, who ends up figuring out a way to get inside this home, and even further than that, goes on to eventually sneak its way into getting into the Sandman's place that he is being held captive. So, because Jessamy goes on and lights this match and is to light this couch on fire, and the security who is watching over the Sandman leaves to try to be the fire brigade, as they say. So Jessamy is trying to go on and use her beak to smack into the glass that the Sandman is being held in. And so eventually, all of a sudden, we have the Raven being killed off by Alex, who is to spot the bird. And eventually, Roderick is telling Alex to clean this bird, and so he does. And so we find out that Ethel Cripps was to have gone on, and after knowing that Roderick does not want this child, Ethel does want the child, so she goes on to eventually take the Sandman's items, the helm, the ruby, and the sand, and she takes all of them as well as $200,000 and runs off to have this baby. And eventually, after Roderick is to find out about that, he ends up going to the Sandman saying, like, well, hey, like, if I go on and I release you now, will you go on and find all this stuff and give them back to me? Or will you go on and so that way you can get all your stuff back, will you give me a reward for eventually releasing you? And the Sandman never goes on and never talks, never says anything. But eventually we have both Alex and we have both Roderick, who finally are starting to bicker and yell at one another. And eventually it leads to Alex kind of pushing his father to have his head being banged against this cell. And Roderick falls over and his head is bleeding out and he dies right then and there. So now we have it to where Alex is to be kind of like the guy who is to now have all these things, have this house and riches and everything like that, because of course now his father is dead. So now even more time has passed, and now we have a much more older Alex that is kind of fearful of the Sandman to say, it's like, well, hey, if I go on and I release you, like, are you not going to harm me? As well as a guy that, of course, Alex is in love with, who I believe is I do not remember. Anyways, so Alex is to find love with another man, and so we go on to eventually have Alex's lover go on to mark up the pentagram while putting Alex in his wheelchair. And so what ends up happening is the Sandman goes on to eventually see that one of these guards had fallen asleep during his shift, and so then the Sandman ends up sneaking into this guy's dream as he's dreaming about being on this beach. The Sandman is to go on and put this guy to sleep, and then is to escape, and eventually is to go off to go back to his dream world, where he is to go on and speak to Lucienne, who is to go on and tell the Sandman that since he has been gone for almost a century, that the dream world isn't what he had left it to be, that it had started to decay, and now the Sandman has come back to a very disheveled dream world to go on and find out that the only things that are really left are Cain and Abel and a dragon-like thing named Gregory, or like they said gargoyle, but like to me, like it looks like a dragon to me. But anyways, we go on into this story, and so the Sandman has to go on and figure out how to get his items back to kind of help him. That he needs to find his helm and his ruby and his sand, and so now the Sandman has to go on and eventually go and speak with these girls called the Three. The Three, or the kindly ones. We have, of course, Lucienne, who is telling the Sandman, it's like, well, why can't you just talk to like Desire or Destiny or anyone else? And the Sandman is like, no, like they have their own realms, like I have mine. So I'm gonna go on and do this myself by just talking to these witches who are the Three, or the kindly ones. So the Sandman just has to sacrifice one of his nightmares this within this realm, and of course he is to go on and meet up with Cain and Abel to eventually find this dragon named Gregory, to eventually just kind of destroy this thing, to eventually have something to bargain with, so that way he can go to meet up with the Three. So we of course have Cain, that is to consistently kill off Abel all of the time. Like at first it becomes very jarring to see like Cain killing Abel, but then we find out that it's like, oh, that's just a constant thing. When we go into episode 2, we start to see that that Cain just consistently, like, he pitchforks Abel, or eventually he takes this hot poker and stabs into Abel, and Cain consistently always buries Abel in this shallow grave, and like it just becomes this kind of running joke of the second episode, where Abel's like, well, yeah, like Cain doesn't always kill me all the time, like so uh we go on and we have the Sandman that is to eventually make his way to meet up with the Three. And we go on and we have the Sandman who goes on to eventually take these items, like this noose, within this one dream where he is to be in front of a bunch of like Japanese characters and so on and so forth. And he ends up taking this one kind of part of land from this one uh, farmer's dream, and so on and so forth. And he ends up taking this one snake, and is to take this egg that eventually is to be this kind of gargoyle, or dragon-like egg to go on and give Cain and Abel another gargoyle to have. So eventually, when Abel is to find the egg, he ends up wanting to name the gargoyle Irving, but Cain is to say that, well, all gargoyles have to have a name with a G, like Goldie or something like that. So Abel's like, well, okay, we'll just call him Goldie, even though Abel will always call the gargoyle uh, Irving instead. Mentioning to Irving a story about Cain and Abel and how they used to live in the same house together, and I thought that was kind of a waste of dialogue, but it is what it is. So we go on to have the Sandman, who makes his way to the Three after going through all of this weird, goofy, dreamlike stuff to eventually meet up with Three, and so we start to see the Three consistently rotate, to where we see like different characters in different spots, because it's meant to be that way. So we go on to eventually have the Sandman asking where all of his items are, and eventually that leads to us finding out that that the sand is to be left with Constantine, and that the helm is to be left with this demon that is having its own pentagram and channeling something, and that the ruby is to, of course, be left with uh, John D, who actually is Ethel Cripp's son. So now that the Sandman is to know where technically his items are, even though we of course have Lucien that is to tell him, it's like, well, like a lot of the times like Three just talk in riddles and like they don't really make sense. But so the Sandman is to want to go off and want to eventually hope that he can go on and find these items. And so Ethel Cripps, of course, is to be a much more older version of herself. And so Ethel Cripps is to go on and be doing all these calls to try and make all these cells for all these certain antique items. And we, of course, have the Corinthian, who is to meet up with Ethel Cripps. We also see the Corinthian, who is to go on and kill somebody by pulling their eyes out, and we end up seeing like this one man who has his eyes taken out, because we of course have the Corinthian who wants to shape the world to make it look like him in a way, because of course the Corinthian has no eyes, but he has like teeth within his eyes. We end up seeing like a lot of memes that end up showcasing that, and that weirdly just became a whole thing for some goofy reason. So the Corinthian goes on to meet up with Ethel Cripps to eventually ask where all of the Sandman's items are, and Ethel is to mention that she doesn't know. And eventually we have it to where the Corinthian is to ask Ethel about her son, and eventually we find out that John is to be held at this mental hospital, it seems, that he is being taken care of. So we go on and we have Ethel, who, while talking to the Corinthians, saying that the Sandman is going to be coming for her, eventually Ethel is to tell the Corinthian that it's like, well, like, I don't have to worry about getting all of those items back to eventually avoid the Sandman, because of course we have Ethel, who is to have this certain amulet or medallion or whatever it is, to eventually have the Corinthian kind of vanish and reappear in the dream world, where he is going on and talking to Lucien, and eventually the Corinthian is to escape the dream world yet again. So we go on to eventually have Ethel again, like I said, making her way to John and kind of talking to him. about how he's being held here and held in this medical hospital. So eventually, I think that seems to be a bulk of what happens within these first two episodes. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I did forget about, because I'm sure that there probably is. Um, I know I probably didn't say all of this in like the perfect order of which that it all played out. There might have also been something that I did forget about. So eventually, the next time that I review this, will probably go on and be um, me maybe doing a rebuttal because I was like, oh, I forgot about this scene, or I forgot about this moment, or I forgot to mention this. But other than that, I think I feel good enough to just call this one a an episode or review, what have you. Um, I honestly, when I went through the very first episode, I skipped. I did not watch the whole thing where it showed like where is the whole season going. I tried to avoid that because I didn't want any real surprises. Um, so I completely skipped past that part, and because I didn't want to know. I wanted to be just kind of like left in the dark about that. So yeah, so let me know in the comments below how you felt about the Sandman, how you felt about the show so far, if you watched the whole show in one fell swoop of a day, because a lot of people go on and do that. But anyways, I think I'm gonna go on and get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. One thing that I did forget about, uh, we did have Alex, who eventually, when the Sandman was to go on and be freed, eventually he found Alex within this dream of him being a older version to eventually becoming a much younger version of himself. And so the Sandman went on and eventually was, because of Alex not going on and freeing the Sandman then turned around and eventually put Alex into eternal sleep. And so eventually that is to have done away with Alex and eventually killed him off, technically. So I wanted to cover that. And eventually, once the Sandman was to eventually become free, I think everyone finally kind of awoken from their sleep, and so on and so forth. Who because I think the dream sickness eventually went away. But anyways, yeah, I think I'm gonna go on and get out of here. I think that's all that I needed to possibly say. I'm gonna go out of my way to just say goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.